Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is our Monday edition of Point of View, and this hour we will spend some time looking at a number of issues, and I would have to say that probably a number of people that do various talk shows did not really anticipate that they would start their particular program. Why talking about abortion? But I sort of had that feeling, and so the very first article we've actually posted here was one that was written by Katie Yoder, and it talks about the Supreme Court decision coming up. Well, if you have not heard, it has come down, and it is disappointing for anybody that's pro-life, although I wasn't necessarily as surprised as some people, and that is Supreme Court ruled today that Louisiana's restriction on abortion violates the Constitution, and it was another one of those 5-4 splits. But the part that maybe got all everybody's attention was one of those 5 was the Chief Justice John Roberts. Now, off air, Kelly Shackelford and I have had some conversations about that, and it does seem to me that what is maybe taking place is Chief Justice John Roberts does not want to make the Supreme Court the center of attack right now and does not want to have it lose its legitimacy. So on the issue, which interestingly enough involved the issue of homosexual rights and transgenderism, you had not only Neil Gorsuch writing the opinion, but Chief Justice Roberts joining with that. I think he did so because he wanted to make sure that if he didn't, maybe he would not be able to assign the opinion to Gorsuch, and you would get up with an opinion that was much more extreme from one of the 4 liberal justices. Possibly. The other possibility, of course, is that Justice Roberts said, you know, this is not really any different than a Texas law that the Supreme Court struck down. So he even talked about precedent, stare decisis, and all those kinds of technical terms that we get into sometimes. And so, if nothing else, he made the Supreme Court relevant again. And for people that are easily discouraged, there are people that when a ruling comes down like this says, you know, what's the point of putting all these conservatives on the court when we get these kind of decisions? Well, first of all, I'm glad you didn't play on my high school basketball team with me, because there were many times when we were way down, and if you had that mindset, we would never have come back and won. Okay, so sometimes the battle has to be taken another day. But it is interesting because one of the biggest criticisms of the Trump campaign up until now, and there have been many, but one of the biggest ones, even from his fellow Republicans and even people perhaps on his campaign, is he seems to be running a 2016 campaign when it comes to the Supreme Court. Because after all, when he ran there, he talked about the fact that we need to get conservative justices on the court, not just the federal court, just the Supreme Court, but all the federal court, and even gave a list of those he might put on the Supreme Court. And because there was an open seat, which everybody knew about, then there was a possibility that if he was elected, he would be able to put 1 or 2, and he has put so far 2 on the Supreme Court. So you might say, well, yeah, but on 2020, that's sort of old news now. And yet, if you watched his rally the other night, and I watched parts of it when he was speaking in Tulsa, Oklahoma, I mean, he spent a fair amount of time talking about judges and justices and, talked about the fact that they have already been able to confirm 200 judges. And hopefully by the end of his term this time, there will be 300, which I thought was pretty aggressive, but some people think that might actually take place. But again, the idea that everybody is pretty much convinced of, there's going to be an opening or two or maybe even three next time. Now, when you see that this court decision goes in a way that has maybe a little more ability to energize the pro-life vote than the pro-choice vote, that's kind of intriguing. Anyway, let's get into it for a little bit. I'm going to do more of it probably in the next hour. We will have Colonel Alan West with us at 1 o'clock, and he may want to talk a little bit about this. We'll get all sorts of comments about him and about the riots and pandemic and all those kinds of things. But the point I wanted to make is that this was a law which required a doctor that was performing abortions or even offering abortion services had to have admitting privileges at a hospital. In some respects, it had only a little bit to do with abortion and mostly just to do with public safety. The fact that this is even controversial shows you how abortion's almost become kind of one of these great untouchable issues, because after all, we know for a fact that in abortion clinics, I see these various emails from various groups like Operation Rescue of how women have been rushed to operating rooms and things like that because of botched abortions, or maybe they try to do it themselves or whatever it might be. And so, nevertheless, this was a requirement not unlike the one from the state of Texas with a vote by then Anthony Kennedy. This one is different in a number of different ways for the fact that it was going to be going to a much more conservative court. So two Louisiana doctors and a clinic sued, and the Supreme Court did rule that it was unconstitutional. And so, again, it was called the Unsafe Abortion Protection Act. We have comments from Carol Tobias, president of the National Right to Life. We're extremely disappointed that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Louisiana's Unsafe Abortion Protection Act. And so that is the case. You can probably imagine as well that there may have been some silver lining. For example, this one comes from the General Counsel of the National Right to Life, James Bopp. We're pleased that at least the two justices appointed by President Trump voted to protect women and to uphold the Louisiana pro-life law. But it has put a quandary, I guess a better way to say it, put the liberal press in a quandary, because this article that I've posted, and I would encourage you to read it because it actually was written before the decision, talked about the fact that there was everybody gearing up for the fact that this would be the first strike against abortion. And so you had the New York Times publishing an opinion piece. What if the Supreme Court rules on abortion and the country shrugs? And the argument being made was we're all worn down, and we are, by the pandemic, by police violence, all sorts of other things. But anyway, she was trying to warn that sweeping changes this case could usher in, make it more depressing. And yet, of course, they got a win. The same thing. Here's a headline for the cult. Will the Supreme Court strike a devastating vote of abortion rights? Well, no, they did not. New York Magazine, is the constitutional right to choose abortion doomed? That one came out June 23rd. And so they're all waited with bated breath. So you would think that at this point there would be cheering. But instead, almost all the conversations today, and of course they'll continue on for another day or two, are what's up with Chief Justice John Roberts. And I think part of it is that he has maybe not been as pro-life as people would hope him to be. I think the real issue is that he's trying to figure out how to protect this court. If there were just a whole sweep of conservative votes and rulings coming down right now, I think it would bring all sorts of people who are already motivated against Donald Trump and against Republicans to just come out even en masse. It may not have been his intention, but it may have worked the other way, because I think there are a fair number of people that say, okay, it illustrates all the more why we need one more justice on the court. We have no guarantee that a Joe Biden is going to put one of those on the court. And we do have a pretty good guarantee that Donald Trump will. And so that's a brief look at the abortion issue, which wasn't my first choice, but that's okay. That's kind of what's in the news at the moment. We'll spend some more time talking about it in the National Hour. Alan West will be with us, Colonel Alan West, for about a half an hour. And then in the 2 o'clock hour, William Lane Craig. Going to get into a little theology, the atonement and the death of Christ, and you'll learn a lot more about basic theology. So we're covering lots on the topics today, and when we come back, we'll talk about this matching fund that we have. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Perhaps you have heard the phrase that people follow their basic principles until they don't. As much as most of us try to follow key principles in our life, whether they are principles of leadership, family, or morality, sometimes an issue arises that changes our behavior. That is certainly true of judicial interpretation. While on the Supreme Court, Justice Neil Gorsuch has staked out his belief that legislatures, not the judiciary, should make law. And he has on more than one occasion been willing to tell Congress or a state legislature to write a less ambiguous law and not depend on the Supreme Court to fix it. That is why his opinion in the Bostock case is most confusing. The editors of the Wall Street Journal started their editorial with these words: "An alien appears to have occupied the body of Justice Neil Gorsuch as he wrote Monday's opinion." When Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was attempting to outlaw discrimination based on such issues as race, color, religion, and national origin. An amendment was proposed to include sex in the statute. It is obvious to just about anyone in 1964 the word sex meant male and female, but Justice Gorsuch ruled that it includes sexual orientation and gender identity. In previous Supreme Court rulings, he has ruled that it's a fundamental canon of statutory construction that words generally should be interpreted as taking their ordinary, contemporary, common meaning at the time Congress enacted the statute. That is not what he and the other justices did in the case. Justice Gorsuch and other justices reinterpreted the meaning of the word sex to fit their desired conclusion. This is a debate that should have been taking place in Congress, but the Supreme Court short-circuited the debate that should have been taking place in a legislative body, not in the court. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, you didn't think we'd spend a lot of time talking about the coronavirus either. Back in May, as we got into June, we thought, okay, maybe we've actually been able to bend the curve, and we're spending as much time talking about that as just about anything else. And so you sort of flip-flop from what has happened in the Supreme Court, what the president is doing, the presidential election, race riots, race protests, all sorts of other kinds of things, and back to, what? The pandemic. And of course, Jim Garrity put it this way: the virus is still there, whether we like it or not. And he pointed out just some of the numbers, in case you haven't looked at them in a while, that just the other day it was 22. Actually, I should say 2,297,000 cases. That's probably a better way to say that. And the country had about 2,637 cases by Monday morning. So that's a jump of 339,000, almost 340,000 cases. So when people say, well, it's just more testing, that's partially true, but there's also a number of other things there as well. And he even goes on to say, yes, I know the number of cases by themselves is not the most important metric, but it's a significant percentage of those who are infected will be asymptomatic, and that most of those who are not elderly or immunocompromised will recover. But guess what? We have more to think about. He said, last day I wrote a morning jolt. 121,000 Americans had succumbed to the coronavirus. As of midnight last night, that death toll was up to 128,000. By the way, it's 128,000 or 120,000, not 120 million, which is what Joe Biden was saying the other day. So again, if you have got a confusion there, I didn't want to get any more confused, since the future president of the United States increased it by 1,000%. Actually, more than that. But anyway, we won't even get into that 1,000 times. Just that would be the better way to say it. And again, we recognize that in some of these cases, they're still trying to sort it out. The figure may include about 1,800 probable deaths in New Jersey added, most of which occurred during the 9-day window and were officially counted during that time period. So they're still trying to figure out exactly how many have died because, as I've said on this program many times before, and others have as well, dying with the coronavirus is different than dying from the coronavirus. But if you look at some of the hospitals that are in the Texas Medical Center in Houston, or even what's going on in Austin and Travis County and a couple of other places, some across the border, these are starting to get full. And so it's, again, the idea that we tried before to bend the curve, and we did bend the curve, and we kept our hospitals from being overwhelmed. But in certain hot spots, we're getting close to capacity again, and the curve bent up because we allowed large gatherings in the form of everything from protests to just people going out to eat, and that's what happened. By the way, I do have some numbers on the protest. People always say, well, how many of these were from the protest? Well, first of all, many of them were outside. Also, many were unmasked. But one of the most incredible upticks, and I have it here, I didn't print it out, maybe I'll print it out later just so to the screen, show the number in Minnesota in 20 to 39, and that just jumps off the chart. And you look at that, and everybody else is pretty stable, and you're thinking, yeah, I know who those are. Those are the ones that were protesting. But in other places, not necessarily. South Carolina basically has called for maybe not to have another protest. Actually, some of the so-called racial justice activists actually said they were going to postpone some of the demonstrations after at least 13 people who participated in the protest already tested positive for the coronavirus. In Los Angeles, I've got some more of these. Again, the number of positive cases jumped from 170 to 206. There's quite a lot here that's illustrating that some of that jump has been due to the protests. That makes sense. But anybody that's trying to say it's only due to the protests, no, it's due to a lot of people crowded in bars, which is why right now the governor of the state of Texas says close down the bars. Crowded in a variety of other venues, not showing any kind of respect for social distancing, not wearing a mask, and so that's why it's increased. But one of the things Jim Garrity says, and I'm going to come back to this, another piece that we've posted here today as well, said that one of the most depressing aspects of the rise in cases over the past 2 weeks has been the persistent desire to hammer the new wave of cases in some sort of my party's governors are good and your party's governors are bad narrative. Most out of the blue states rule, red states drool variety. I love that line. So, yes, at the moment, Texas, Florida, Arizona are getting hit hard, but you can also go to other places, California, Oregon, Washington in the past, New York, that were getting hard in the past. So let's get away from trying to say, well, it's your governor that ruined it. I mean, there are a few governors that are in trouble in New York City, and New York State would be one example of that, but I don't think the media will ever hold them accountable. And so this editorial that appeared in the Wall Street Journal I thought was good. COVID comparisons, Europe and U.S. The America is a failure reporting has a heavy dose of partisanship, the editors say, because they point out that the scientists are studying why the coronavirus hasn't had more of a resurgence in Europe after countries lifted their lockdowns, while some states in the United States battle explosive outbreaks. But the epidemiologists and the media already know why. It's because of these irresponsible governors that are Republican, and, of course, the most irresponsible person of all, Donald Trump. But that is, of course, not the case. One of the keys to understanding this, if indeed you have some objectivity, and I do fear that more and more people have lost it, but let's at least give some of you that are looking for objectivity, is to recognize there's a lot more people in the United States. One of the pictures here is they have customers actually having coffee at a place in Rome, which I just was there in the fall. I know exactly where that took place. Then they're outside, of course, too, but if you recognize that the population of Italy would be like a state almost in this country, you've got to start to go back a little ways. Also recognize they were hit so hard that a lot of people that might have died in a second wave already died in the first wave. So think that through for just a minute. But okay, let's do a very reasonable, more of an apples to apples comparison, and that would be deaths per 100,000. If you look at that, the United States recorded deaths per 100,000 is 38. United Kingdom is 66. Spain is 61. Italy is 57. France is 44. Do you see the point? These, if you do deaths per 1,000, the United States has done extremely well. And you, of course, would not know that if you watch the mainstream press. And death rates are kind of a lagging indicator anyway. Arizona, Florida, and Texas are still well below Europe because of that, but who knows what will happen as time goes on. So anyway, this particular editorial says, it's too early to draw conclusions about long-term success or failure. Europe began reopening its internal borders 2 weeks ago, and infections may tick up once again as people travel. Germany has already had a spike in cases in the last week, albeit fewer than what you've had in the southern states in America. Many, by the way, these spikes are tied to meat packing plants, some of those which are in the Midwest. So you have to really get into the data if you're really interested. And the sad reality is, many people are just simply using it as a political hammer to hit others. But no one has done everything right in the pandemic, they conclude, but America is a failure. Reporting is an excessive meme as much as the occasional mistake by the president to say the pandemic will soon be over. No, it's wrong on both cases. But nevertheless, I just thought I'd bring a little of that to you. We are in the midst of some major changes, and who knows whether we'll have another lockdown. I don't know that we will, and I don't know that the people will follow it. But nevertheless, that is what we are dealing with, and we want to try to give you more accurate information than sometimes you get from many other people in the press. As we go to a break, let me just mention that we really are coming to the last 2 days of this fiscal year. Our fiscal year ends June 30th. Today is June 29th. And over the weekend, and I'm going to bring Warren Kelly in here just after the break here to explain this, we went from a matching grant that came in last week of about $50,000 to one now of $100,000. So the bottom line is this. The match will work if you give. These are ones that aren't guaranteed, but if we bring in $36,000, then we'll get $36,000. If we could bring in $70,000, we'll get $70,000. If we get $100,000, we'll get $100,000. So your participation is absolutely key, and the way you can participate is simply to go to the website. You will see the matching grant. It says we have 1 day, 11 hours, and 31 minutes before it's over. So if you want to participate at all, and I would encourage you to do so, this is a dollar for dollar match, which means your dollars actually are doubled. A $50 gift becomes a $100 gift, $500 gift becomes a $1,000 gift. So go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says Give Now, and you'll help us meet the match. Of course, you can always call the pledge line, 800-347-5151. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that with Warren Kelly in studio right after this.
America's major media are out of control. Many of them apparently believe their role is to publish things that create hysteria and outrage with false narratives, and facts don't matter. You don't believe that. Neither do we at Point of View. Truth matters. Facts matter, and that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020 will be determined over the next handful of hours. June is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership today will help us set our budget for the coming months. You and Point of View, a powerful team for such a time as this. And right now, every gift you give will be doubled up to $100,000. So double your investment when you join the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't wait. Visit or call now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and just for a few minutes, I thought we would chat with Warren Kelly, who's the president of Point of View, and then we'll get back to some of the issues in the news. Don't forget, we'll have Alan West with us for about a half an hour from now, and then maybe I'll bring Warren in just one more time for the national audience to know that. William Lane Craig will be with us at 2 o'clock. But, Warren, I thought if nothing else, we might explain this because it has been kind of unusual. Earlier last week, when we started talking about we're getting close to our year end, I didn't mention a match because because we didn't have one.
Right.
And then even as we went to the weekend, I'm pretty sure we just said we had a $50,000 match, and now I'm talking about a $100,000 match. So fill in some of the details for our listeners.
Well, for some of you, you heard Foster Freeze was on with Kerby on Thursday, and he surprised us on air by saying that he would match anybody's gift up to $50,000. So we were very excited about that. But then the very end of the day, I mean, it was 5 o'clock on Friday, got contact from another of our donors who was very gracious as well to do the same thing, that this other donor has offered to match up to $50,000. So now we have $100,000. So Kerby, that's a very good thing. We have a $100,000 match. But the end of our fiscal year is tomorrow. And so we've got to do this quickly, or because as you said on the air a minute ago, if we don't raise the money, we only get what we raised by the deadline.
Yes, and since we mentioned Foster Freeze, most people know him because he's been on the program, and I've seen you go through this 2 or 3 times, and each time they want to know, did we raise it, how much did we raise, and then show them, and then they finally send a check. So It's not like we're sitting on a check right now waiting to be cashed. We're not even necessarily promised anything other than the fact that as a very gracious individual who's been investing in so many different areas, I mean, every time I turn around, I find out somebody else who has benefited from his philanthropy. And because he believes in what we're doing, was willing to come forward with that. So really what we have, if I look at the matching fund right now, it says 1 day, 11 hours, 22 minutes. And if nothing else, I would encourage you to click on that button. When you click on the button, Give Now, let's talk about that because we talk about for such a time as this. That's Esther, and here we find ourselves in a time of uncertainty. We'll be talking about that uncertainty with Alan West in about a half an hour. And I think, if anything, even just in the last half hour, I've tried to help people understand what's in the press. Sometimes things that are poorly represented, maybe biased and all the rest. And so if you are looking for news, information, commentary, book interviews, and all sorts of other things, I would say that's why I, without hesitation, encourage you to support Point of View.
Yes, this is a critical time for our nation, and we hear almost every day from people saying that they're listening longer, they're listening more often, they're relying more heavily on the information they get from you in the program because of all that's happening in our country. And things seem to change every day, and they need a good, reliable source of information to get the information that they need to protect their family and to take care of themselves. And so they rely on Point of View, and we rely on you. We cannot deliver the information that Kerby puts out there each day unless we have your support. And as you mentioned, both of these donors wait until we tell them how much we've raised before they write the check. So we really need to hear from you because time is running out.
Time really is. And again, there's some ways you can participate. I'm finding more and more of you just say, look, I'll just go online and you'll see the banner says $100,000 matching fund for such a time as this. Fiscal year ends June 30th. And there's a real red button there. Click on that. And your gift of $50 becomes $100. A gift of $100 becomes $200. I'm hoping maybe there's somebody out there that said, I can give $1,000 and that becomes $2,000 because they're going to need a few of those gifts to begin to make that work. And if you want to talk to someone, that number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. And for the old school, they can still write to Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221.
But please get it in the mail by tomorrow so we have a postmark on there so that we can count it for the match.
Yes, so very good. Well, Warren, thanks for dropping by. I'll
thanks for
maybe see
me.
you in about an hour here, and we'll just give people, especially on the national audience, an opportunity. So we'll get there. Alan West will be with us shortly, but let me just talk about this because one of the other issues that we were getting into was the press is blaming governors, and if you want to blame them, knock yourself out. But there is really interesting stuff that is coming down. This one comes again from the editors, in this case of, I think it was National Review. And what they were pointing out is they said, look, the reality is that Greg Abbott, Ron DeSantis, and Doug Ducey and others are talking about are reasonable, public-spirited men who never said they would insist on a full reopening regardless of the consequences. Abbott has closed bars back down, further restricted the capacity of restaurants. He's also stopped elective surgeries again in some of these hard-hit areas. He'll allow counties to mandate wearing masks, which is what we we do right here in this studio until I get into the studio and then I take it off. In fact, it's the first time I've seen, I think, the face of Warren Kelly without a mask in a couple of days because we have to take him off when we're in the studio here. And Ron DeSantis, too, has shuttered bars while Florida localities are tightening up on some of the restrictions. So the point that they are making is that you're going to have these waves, and we've had some waves in New York and the Northeast, and in some respects those have not regenerated, I think, in part because they were hit so hard, and now we are seeing the same kinds of things happening in some of these southern states. And so if you want to make a political issue out of it, well, I can't stop you. It is a free country, but I think some of that is just very unfair. And the reality is, if you really are concerned about the reopening of America and the allowing of individuals to go back to work, then do what you can to keep us safe. Even the other day, our family decided that they wanted to get some takeout from this very nice Mexican food place nearby. And as I went there were some people sitting outside, but they weren't a lot. But I drove by a whole lot of restaurants that weren't open. I don't know if they're never going to open again or they just simply have gone broke. And so we recognize that the lockdown has had an economic devastation. We've talked about the medical devastation of people not getting treatments and getting surgeries and not getting various screenings and the rest. I have been able to go to a doctor once and to a dentist once and to a barber once, but all of those were done in very safe situations. And if you keep us safe, we're in good shape. Okay, one more point, and this one comes from The Atlantic. We're not always quoting from The Atlantic, and I didn't post this one, but it was of concern. And that is the CDC, you know who they are, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They have made a big mistake, and it's a mistake they keep making, and it is not helping, for example, states like Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Texas, and other states, which have now had to try to make sense of facts and figures that don't make any sense. And the point is very simple. What the CDC has done is combine two different kinds of tests. You have those tests which diagnose the current coronavirus infection and have mixed those together with those that determine whether you've ever had the virus. And those are different because one is a viral test, another is an antibody test, and they tell you two very different kinds of things. And so some people have said this is a technical error, but this very good article here says, no, it's not a technical error. States have set quantitative guidelines for reopening based upon these flawed data points. But don't take my word for it. This is what the professor of global health at Harvard said. He's also the director of the Harvard Global Health Institute. He says, you got to be kidding. How could the CDC make this mistake? This is a mess. And so you are once again confronted by the fact that though I have incredible respect for the people in the medical fields, I grew up in a family where my grandfather was a doctor, my father was in the pharmaceutical field, and I've worked with all sorts of doctors. I've spoken many times at Christian medical and dental societies and have individuals that even support this ministry that are doctors. So great respect for doctors, great respect for the medical profession. But I also recognize that doctors are human, doctors can be politicized, and also bureaucrats can make really big mistakes. And this is one of those. And so just as the other day I was pointing out that you have Lancet, which is kind of the premier medical journal for the UK, having to retract an article. The New England Journal of Medicine, another just outstanding medical journal, had to retract two different articles. There is some really interesting stuff coming down right now where individuals in these science and medical fields are saying, when we go back and try to replicate a study, we're not able to do so. Well, that's kind of the gold standard of science and scientific method. If I do an experiment, I give you all the data, you should be able to go back and do the same thing and get the same results. And we're really starting to recognize that between laziness and fraud and maybe politicization, we're not being well served by those people in the medical field. And here is a chronic problem of actually mixing two different kinds of data and making it difficult for some of these states to make reasonable decisions. And in some cases, then they pass them on to localities, and we're kind of flying with dust in our face, kind of like the ones from the Sahara Desert right now. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just mention that one of the other articles we've posted here, I'm just going to mention it now because I suspect it will be part of our conversation with Colonel Alan West in about 15 minutes, is a very good piece by Fred Lucas, who has written a couple pieces now on Black Lives Matter. And this one is 4 things the liberal media won't tell you about Black Lives Matter, because in the past we've talked about some of the other articles we've posted. And so I thought I'd just mention the 4 so it's on the table. Then we'll come back maybe later and talk about that. And if Alan West doesn't get into it a half an hour from now, I'll get into it again. And the first one is, are Black Lives Matter leaders trained Marxists? And the answer, of course, is yes, if you've listened to this program at all. Patrice Cullors and a variety of others have actually said that. Matter of fact, she was the one on Real News Network said, myself and Alicia, which is Lisa Garza, in particular, are trained organized, we're trained Marxists. So sometimes when people say, well, you're calling them Marxist, that's not fair. I'm just giving them the name they give themselves. And so that is the first point. Then the next one is, what's the official organization? there's really more than one Black Lives Matter. There's a Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, and then there's a couple of others that are just kind of the Black Lives Matter Network Foundation and a variety of others. So it's kind of, and there's an Alliance for Global Justice that has supported them. So there actually is more than one, but we will most of the time when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, we're referring to those that are actually receiving the kinds of funds and the support that has been given to them. Then number 3, what does the organization want? Well, I think you've already figured that out, because in some respects, they have not only taken on the issue of race, but we've talked about everything from reparations to a whole issue of sexual orientation and gender identity. For example, this comes from their statements. We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We're self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift Black trans folk, and it goes on and on from there. You can kind of get a pretty good idea, because I did post a piece a while back in which it just said, even if you agree that Black lives matter, and I believe all lives matter and all human beings have value and dignity because they're created in the image of God, if you want to support this idea of Black lives matter, that's fine. But the movement is really something, as a Christian, I think you have to seriously question. And then the last one, which is, again, kind of new to all of us, is what is Thousand Currents? Well, Thousand Currents is actually what underwrites the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, and it's envisioning a world where humanity thrives as a creative force that is in reciprocal and independent with nature and creates loving, equitable, and just societies. So then you get into, okay, who's on the board? Well, that's people like Susan Rosberg, a convicted felon who participated in the bombing of buildings in Northeast. You start getting into some of the radical kinds of issues there. Communist organizations and the rest. So it's a really good piece if you, first of all, say, well, I really want to support African Americans. I really want to support this idea that Black Lives Matter, but I do want to know a little bit more about what I'm signing up for. Then when you read this, I think you'll be pretty shocked. And as, again, Fred Lucas points out, these are 4 things the liberal media won't tell you about Black Lives Matter. But we did, and it's on the website. It's the second article, and I would encourage you to read it and post it on your Facebook page and see what kind of reaction you get. Just before we take a break, I thought I'd try to lighten it up, although I don't know how lightened it's going to be. But should we keep singing the Star Spangled Banner at athletic events? It's still somewhat hypothetical. I don't know when we're ever going to actually have sports again. They keep talking about a shorter baseball series, and they're talking about playing basketball in Orlando, and then we start hearing about various COVID outbreaks, so I don't know. But I thought I would start with this one from Tulsa Athletic, which announced that it would no longer play the Star Spangled Banner. Now, you might say, why? Well, the argument in the press release is, from our beginning, we've developed a culture of inclusion and acceptance at Tulsa Athletic, and we live in a country that allows us to freely speak our voice. Knock yourself out. So you might say, well, what are they going to sing? Well, they, instead of not singing anything, which I think is just the better answer. I mean, even before I get into this, just think about this. Soccer is, for example, going to have people from all over the world, and a lot of these individuals from I don't know, they could be from Spain, they could be from Portugal, they could be from Guatemala, they could be from Mexico, they could be from Argentina, they could be maybe even from China, other places. They got to stand during the Star Spangled Banner. Okay, they're part of the United States, but does that make a lot of sense? And when you go to a hockey game, sometimes they have to play both the Canadian anthem and the U.S. anthem, and it just gets complicated after a while. And so I could understand why you might just say, okay, we won't do anything. Oh, no. Tulsa Athletic said, we're going to play Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. And if you think that is nothing more than just an eye roller, it wasn't until I read the piece by Todd Starnes that I said, now, they might actually be making a political statement if they are aware of this. Who knows whether they are? Because Todd Starnes, in about his 4th paragraph, says, this is an interesting decision because Woody Guthrie was reportedly a vocal supporter of communism and was sympathetic to the causes of communism. National Public Radio claims that This Land Is Your Land was written by a Marxist response to God Bless America. So again, if it's what NPR says, must be right. Apparently this is their article here, that Woody Guthrie was irritated by Irving Berlin's God Bless America sung by Kate Smith, which seemed to be endlessly playing on the radio in the late 1930s. So as National Public Radio reported, he was so irritated he wrote the song as a last retort, at first sarcastically calling it God Blessed America for Me before renaming it This Land Is Your Land. History.com noted that Guthrie was in California, and when he came into contact with the Communist Party and became increasingly sympathetic to its causes. Many of his songs reflected a strong commitment to the common working people and became somewhat of a musical spokesman for that. So they want to play, again, what is so interesting is This Land Is Your Land, written by an individual that was sympathetic to the communists. Now, they may not have understood the reaction to that, but we're not done. Here is another journalist saying that we need to cancel the Star Spangled Banner and replace it with John Lennon's Imagine. I'm not making this up. Okay, why Imagine, according to this article by Nate Jackson? Because according to Powell, and this again is the individual Kevin Powell, who's arguing for this, it's the most beautiful, most unifying, all people, all backgrounds together kind of song you could have. It's also a song written by an Englishman who dreams of a world with no countries, no religion, and nothing to kill or die for. That's right. Lenin himself described the lyrics as virtually the Communist Manifesto. So maybe it is time to think seriously of whether we should even have the Star Spangled Banner at some of these political events, if everybody's going to kneel and disrespect the flag and use it as a political statement. But I'm not convinced that This Land Is Your Land or Imagine are great alternatives to that. But that's where we find ourselves today in 2020, in the second to the last day of June, which is, again, a time where you can respond, even as we go to a break, and help us, because we have that matching fund, a dollar for dollar matching fund. And so if you'd like to give somebody a call, we take calls off the air, 800-347-5151, the pledge line. But most importantly, probably just simple. Just go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that banner that says Give Now, and we've given you some suggested donation amounts, but you can add in something else as well, and that will be a way in which we can make sure that we are able to meet our match. Let's take a break. When we come back, Colonel Alan West will be with us. We're going to talk about some of this uncertainty in America, and I'm sure he's got some thoughts about what we can and should do. All that coming up right after this.
America's major media are out of control. Many of them apparently believe their role is to publish things that create hysteria and outrage with false narratives, and facts don't matter. You don't believe that. Neither do we at Point of View. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020 will be determined over the next handful of hours. June is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership today will help us set our budget for the coming months. You and Point of View, a powerful team for such a time as this. And right now, every gift you give will be doubled up to $100,000. So double your investment when you join the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't wait. Visit or call now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I've recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do.
in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I think y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Monday edition here of Point of View. Second to last day of our fiscal year, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the matching fund that we have a little bit later. And if you go to our website, you're going to find at least one article on the Supreme Court abortion decision, which unfortunately came down today in the wrong way, 5-4, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Have one on 4 things the liberal media won't tell you about Black Lives Matter, and much more that we will get to. So there are all sorts of things that we will cover over the next couple of hours, but we are privileged to have with us Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, who's just been in the news every time we turn around. An individual that, of course, served in the military with great distinction, also served in Congress in Florida's 22nd District. For a time was the director of the National Center for Policy Analysis, now right at the moment kind of the interim CEO and president of the Hope Center, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. An individual that graduated from the University of Tennessee, as well as having master's degrees from Kansas State University and the U.S. Army Command. But he's also been in the news because he likes to ride motorcycles and had a horrific crash and is still mending, but looking very good. So, Colonel Alan West, it is always great to have you on the program with us.
Well, it's good to be with you, Kerby, and I tell you what, it's just the grace of God that saved my life back on the 23rd of May.
And again, you are not only doing that, but running for the chairman of the Texas Republican Party and a variety of others. But I wanted to get right into it because, if nothing else, we posted one of your pieces, which was entitled, "Anyone Remember George Floyd?" And, of course, we can use any one of your commentaries that people will really enjoy getting because you have so many. But that one, I thought, was reminding us of the fact that we're in the midst of this unprecedented uncertainty. Had a pandemic, then we've had protests, then we've had almost like riots, and now we're kind of back to the pandemic, which I'll get to a little bit later this hour or next. But it seems to me that people sort of lost focus and even lost control of some of these protests, and that's why you wrote that piece, isn't it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because what I see happening is the irrational emotionalism that's being stoked by the leftist media, as well as the taking over of this issue by, those who have an ideological agenda that they're trying to push forward. And that's why we see this anarchy and all of the things that are happening on our streets. Tearing down all of these monuments, memorials, and, wrecking our history and our traditions and values, that has nothing to do with what happened with George Floyd. And anyone that saw that video, I think that 110% of us in the United States of America, that just shows the overwhelming support, would have said that this was wrong. This was horrific. We don't care that this was a person that was arrested. He still has human dignity. And for someone to put their full weight in their knee on his carotid artery and basically murder him while the other 3 police officers stood there and watched, that was wrong. But to go out now and see all of the defacing of our monuments and the attack to the very institutions, when you have an organization that really is an avowed Marxist organization, that's what their leaders are, Black Lives Matter, for the leader in New York City to come out and say that if our demands aren't met, we're going to burn down the system. Their demands have nothing to do with the issues that are facing the black community. Their demands are just Marxist, progressive socialist issues.
Well, and again, a lot of people might say, wait, a Marxist? Well, I didn't hear that. And that's one of the reasons we posted this piece by Fred Lucas, things the liberal media won't tell you. And there are some really direct quotes right now from two of the founders saying, well, wait a minute, we're trained organizers, we're trained Marxists. So when we call them Marxist, and when you look at some of the things that are on, say, Black Lives Matter's website, I think you can really understand very quickly that you're dealing with a group that is using, obviously, racial tensions and using some times in which police have overreacted to advance an agenda that I think most of our listeners would be horrified if they realized what the true agenda was of Black Lives Matter movement.
No, you're absolutely right. And when I think about one of the most prevalent issues in the urban population centers that have been run by the left for the last 60, 70 years, it's the destruction of the traditional nuclear two-parent household. When I was born in 1961, the black family, man and woman in the house raising children, it was like 77%. Today it's 24%. But yet when you go to the Black Lives Matter website, what did they say? They say the traditional nuclear family is a representation of white supremacy. And that's not, what the black community, that was one of the strengths of the black community. And here they are speaking against it. But yet when you have an organization, Planned Parenthood, that was founded by an avowed white supremacist and a racist, where 70% of Planned Parenthood clinics are located in those black communities, those urban centers. And since 1973, Roe versus Wade, 20 million black babies have been murdered in the womb. We don't hear Black Lives Matter speaking about Margaret Sanger. We don't hear Black Lives Matter saying that Hillary Clinton, the recipient of the Margaret Sanger Award, that's reprehensible. That is offensive to them. That's not right. And so this whole cancel culture is about canceling the culture that does not agree with their ideological agenda. That's all this is about.
I would think so. And one of the things you've said so often, and we've had other people on this program, is to remind us that the black family, in some respects, was more intact before the welfare state established. I've got this one piece by Walter Williams, just came out the other day, that he said that the black illegitimacy rate born out of wedlock was about 11%. Mm-hmm. Most black children actually were in two-parent homes. And so even when you talk about some horrible things in our past, whether it's racism or Jim Crow laws, the black family survived that, but it didn't survive the Great Society programs, did it?
It did not. And really, truthfully, Kirby, that's the discussion that we should be having. We should not have people that are trying to drive an ideological agenda, and like I said, they're media accomplices, saying that we need to have the discussion about race. The real thing we need to be discussing is the failure of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs and what it did to decimate our urban centers and those communities. Because you're right, to sit up here and say that, all of this that we see happening is a result of slavery, you're skipping, as we used to say down south, you're whistling past the graveyard. You are not paying attention to all of the, hundreds of years of things that have happened in certain, communities based upon certain policies that have really been advocated for by one political party. And I think we know who that is. But again, you come back, you look at small business entrepreneurship, the intact family, the education. There was once upon a time when there were more blacks married, raising families, than any other segment of society in the United States of America. And Rob Woodson talks about that as well as Walter Williams. So those are the conversations. Those are the things that we need to be talking about. And again, that's why I reiterate how important it is to have you and Point of View Radio out there bringing the truth into the Christian community and the community as a whole.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue with Lieutenant Colonel Alan West. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And we were quoting from Walter Williams. We posted some of that. Thomas Sowell a while back, I love what he said. I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty. So maybe we need to find some different ways to address this, and especially, of course, so many families and neighborhoods right now devastated first by the pandemic and then by some of the looting and the riots. That is something that we will continue to talk about. When we come back, we'll get into a couple more of the very important issues with Colonel Alan West. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Perhaps you have heard the phrase that people follow their basic principles until they don't. As much as most of us try to follow key principles in our life, whether they are principles of leadership, family, or morality, sometimes an issue arises that changes our behavior. That is certainly true of judicial interpretation. While on the Supreme Court, Justice Neil Gorsuch has staked out his belief that legislatures, not the judiciary, should make law. And he has on more than one occasion been willing to tell Congress or a state legislature to write a less ambiguous law and not depend on the Supreme Court to fix it. That is why his opinion in the Bostock case is most confusing. The editors of the Wall Street Journal started their editorial with these words: "An alien appears to have occupied the body of Justice Neil Gorsuch as he wrote Monday's opinion." When Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was attempting to outlaw discrimination based on such issues as race, color, religion, and national origin. An amendment was proposed to include sex in the statute. It is obvious to just about anyone in 1964 the word sex meant male and female, but Justice Gorsuch ruled that it includes sexual orientation and gender identity. In previous Supreme Court rulings, he has ruled that it's a fundamental canon of statutory construction that words generally should be interpreted as taking their ordinary, contemporary, common meaning at the time Congress enacted the statute. That is not what he and the other justices did in the case. Justice Gorsuch and other justices reinterpreted the meaning of the word sex to fit their desired conclusion. This is a debate that should have been taking place in Congress, but the Supreme Court short-circuited the debate that should have been taking place in a legislative body, not in the court. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we are privileged to have Colonel Alan West with us for a little bit longer. We'll take a phone call as well, 1-800-351-1212. I'll spend a little bit more time later talking about the Supreme Court decision, but I wanted to get your thoughts. If nothing else, it illustrates that you have 4 liberals on the court, and then sometimes the Supreme Court and the Constitution is whatever Chief Justice John Roberts thinks it is, and so in this case, it went 5-4 the other way. Now, there are some out there, Colonel West, that say, well, that's why I just need to give up on all that. And I've jokingly said earlier, glad they weren't on my high school basketball team. Lots of times we would be able to come back from a deficit. If nothing else, I think it really emphasizes all the more how important this election is. And if indeed a Donald Trump does win re-election, you have a lot of other judges and justices that will be on the various federal courts. And if Joe Biden is elected, those will be very different kind of appointees to the courts, won't they?
You're absolutely right, and I think that's one of the things we have to come to understand is that the progressive socialist left in America operates not based upon the 3 branches of government, which are the executive, the legislative, and judiciary. They more so focus on the 3 branches of rule, which are the media, academia, and our courts. And so when you talk about judicial activism, I mean, that's their focus. I mean, you look at recently what just happened here in Texas, where you had a judge, San Antonio area, that ruled in favor with the Texas Democrat Party about mail-in ballots based upon the quote-unquote fear of catching COVID-19. That has nothing to do with a disability, but yet they were trying to push that on through. So you got to realize that the next president of the United States of America from this election, 2020, we'll get another chance to appoint at least 2 new Supreme Court justices. And so how do we want our courts to rule? Do we want them to rule according to our rule of law, or do we want them to rule according to their ideological agenda and their activist agenda?
Right now, we seem to have a lot of people that are still saying, well, maybe Joe Biden would be a good idea. But I'm hoping somewhere along the line there in the campaigns, if they ever get out of the basements, make a distinction between anarchy and a real leftward twist, which we're starting to see, or law and order. And even though there are some that will want to simply say that minority individuals find themselves oftentimes fearful of the police, they'd rather have the police than no police at all. They'd rather have someone protect their business or their home rather than what we've seen unfold over the last couple of weeks. So as an individual who's run a campaign and running a campaign right now, what kind of advice would you give to individuals that are trying to get your vote this November?
I think you give people a very clear choice, a very clear delineation. It's about whether or not you want people to be able to decide that they can be victors, or do you want to make people victims? It's the understanding that elected officials do not have an enumerated power or a right to determine who or what is essential. It is about the rule of law or mob rule. And when you draw those clear points and delineations, I think that people will make the right decision. But what the media and the left and others will try to do is make this about an individual. They'll make it about personalities. Or, of course, they will try to get a false narrative out there, which is what we talked about in our previous segment. The conversation has to be about racism. The conversation is not about the failure of the Great Society programs. And so we need to be able to talk about the real cancers that are there in the urban centers in the United States of America. And again, you and I agree on this point. The Christian community needs to understand that it is about whether or not we will be driven back into the catacombs, or we will continue to have that very first liberty, which is the freedom of religion and the free exercise thereof. Because if not, we're going to have people that will determine what your freedom of worship is and where that worship can be conducted.
And if anybody doubts that, you just mentioned a minute ago in the last segment, the cancel culture. It almost would take me a good couple of segments to read off all the things that have the cancel culture mobs have been trying to get rid of, whether it's, Aunt Jemima, whether it's individuals that even raise a question about Black Lives Matter, whether it's somebody who maybe decades ago was in blackface, whether it's, an Oklahoma State coach that had a jersey on, I guess it was a T-shirt that was a particular news outlet that somebody didn't like, and Splash Mountain. I mean, the list is going on and on and on. And so if you think that you're going to be immune to that, or if you think you're going to be able to bow the knee enough, or that, and of course, J.K. Rowling, I've got that coming up tomorrow. Here we are again, the whole situation in which she is actually supportive of the transgender movement, but not supportive enough. And so they're even trying to use that against her. So if you think it's not going to come against Christians, you got to rethink that, don't you?
You do. You absolutely have to rethink that, because the thing that is underlying in the undertone here is secular humanism. And secular humanism does not want anyone to believe in anything other than the right of man, being government, to be able to determine your outcomes. And when you think about the fact that we're in our Independence Week, 244 years since the Declaration of Independence, America is unlike any other country, where our founding was based upon this belief in the natural rights theory of John Locke. It was brought to life when Jefferson said that the inalienable rights endowed to each and every one of us are from our Creator God, and those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No other country has been founded on that premise, Kerby, and that ties right back to our Judeo-Christian faith heritage. So if the secular humanists are successful in removing the Judeo-Christian God from the marketplace of ideas and fundamental principles and values, then guess what? Guess who's in charge? It comes right back to the divine rights theory that existed before John Locke, which means man. And so then you will have the president or the governor or the mayor or the county judge deciding your buy and your leave. You know, as Joe Biden said, one of the executive orders he's going to put out there is everyone's got to wear a mask. I'm sorry. That's not one of the things that you can just go out there and declare, just the same as these despots that we see happening right here in Dallas County.
And again, one of the things I think is so interesting is a lot of these decisions, like statutes and others, maybe you would make an argument that something should be taken down. So can we have a deliberative process? Now, more and more, you're having either the mob making the decision out there, or we have unelected bureaucrats making the decision, or in some cases, elected individuals that may or may not even have the authority. So if nothing else, I hope that this really emphasizes for our listeners the importance of the election. But just before we let you go, I want to first of all encourage people to go to Old School Patriot, theoldschoolpatriot.com. You don't even have to remember that because we have that link there as well. But I know that you have been a very faithful supporter to Point of View. And so I thought just before I let you go, you might talk to our listeners, since we have a match on the table and we only have just about this day and tomorrow to reach that match. What would you say to our listeners and why they should support Point of View?
I would say very simple. We talked about the three branches rule for the progressive socialist left, and one of those branches is the media. They want to control the narrative. They want to control the information, and that's why they would love to see a Point of View and Kerby Anderson not be out there spreading the truth and sharing thoughts, perspectives, and ideas that are contrary to their ideological agenda. But if anything, let me just remind people that an organization that is led by avowed Marxists, Black Lives Matter, which is an oxymoronic name, they have recently raised over $460 million in the last couple of months in the United States of America, $50 million of which were raised right here in the great state of Texas. And so here we have Kerby Anderson and Point of View Radio begging you to support them. But yet we have an organization that seeks to, as the leader from New York City said, burn the system down. And they're getting $464 million in support, $50 million from the Lone Star State. Something's wrong with that equation. So I'm challenging people to meet the match that is out there and keep Kerby Anderson, his voice, his ministry, which I am so happy is part of this Hope Center, where I have been on the board and now I'm the president and CEO, because we need more strong Christian ministries that are out there standing upon God's word.
Colonel Alan West, always great to have you in studio, or in this case by phone, and wish you well, and thank you for your willingness to step up right now in the Hope Center. We'll probably talk more about that in the future, but let's take a break. And as he pointed out, we have a match on the table, and matter of fact, after the break, I'm going to bring Warren Kelly in here, because when I left you on Friday, we had a match that was up to $50,000. Now it's up to $100,000, so I want him to maybe explain how that happened. But the bottom line is, it's a match, and it's a dollar for dollar match, which means that if you want to give $100, it becomes $200. $500 becomes $1,000. And we do not receive the match money until you actually give. So right now, let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net, or you can call the pledge line, 1-800-347-5151. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
America's major media are out of control. Many of them apparently believe their role is to publish things that create hysteria and outrage with false narratives, and facts don't matter. You don't believe that. Neither do we at Point of View. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020 will be determined over the next handful of hours. June is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership today will help us set our budget for the coming months. You and Point of View, a powerful team for such a time as this. And right now, every gift you give will be doubled up to $100,000. So double your investment when you join the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't wait. Visit or call now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But I thought I'd bring Warren Kelly, president of Point of View, in for just a few minutes, because if you were listening on Friday, as we said goodbye to you on Friday, we said, well, we have a $50,000 match fund. If you go to the website right now, you've heard me say that we have a $100,000 match fund. And some people, Warren, probably wondered, okay, what happened? How did this happen?
Well, it was a big surprise for us, a very nice surprise. We, many of you heard on Thursday, we had Foster Freeze on, and he, at the end of his interview, offered to match your gift up to $50,000 to help with our fiscal year-end campaign. We were very excited and very surprised by that. But then at the very end of the day, literally 5 o'clock on Friday, excuse me, we had another contact from a donor who also would like to match your gift up to $50,000. So now we have a $100,000 match. That's wonderful news, but it's also a little concerning for me because we've never had that much of a match in this short of a time to try to do it, because the end of our fiscal year is tomorrow. And so we have got to hear from you right away if we're going to see this happen.
And again, we've pointed out, and I'll point it out again, it is what we raise is what is matched.
Exactly.
It's not like we're sitting on some checks right now that, so that's really important as well. And this has been a kind of a crazy year. Matter of fact, if you click on the Give Now button, it says, we live in a time of uncertainty. So in some respects, I would hope that you would support any ministry that you're aware of. And if you've listened, you know that I've been trying to be fairly generous. When we've had Gary Bauer on, we've talked about American values. Even on Friday, once again, I talked about First Liberty and Kelly Shackelford, because unlike a lot of ministries that say, we're the only ones out there doing this, we recognize this is a team effort, and we bring a lot of different guests on the program, including, of course, Colonel Alan West, just as we did a few minutes ago. And so I think it's even more important for you to support all those organizations. But sometimes you hear about those organizations, support those organizations, but you forget about the fact you heard it here on Point of View.
Exactly. And, you know, Kerby, you've heard me say it many times, and you've heard the comments. We hear from our listeners so frequently over the last few months that this is such a time of uncertainty. This is such a time when it seems like it's almost a different world every time we wake up. They're relying on the information they get from you and Point of View so much more than they have in the past. But there's no way for us to deliver that information without the help of our listening audience.
And again, I'm going to get into some of the articles we've posted here today, one on the Supreme Court abortion case, also the 4 things media won't tell you about Black Lives Matter, and you heard a little bit of that from Colonel Alan West, and maybe if we have time, we'll get into D.C. statehood and a few other things that have been passed. So there's just a lot of issues we will try to get into today. And if you find yourself saying, well, I heard that at Point of View, and I've heard it nowhere else, maybe that's reason for support. So let's, Warren, talk about what they can do. They can go to the website right now, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Give Now, and there's some suggested donations, or you can put in whatever you would want. They can also give us a call, and as I walked out of the studio, I saw somebody on a phone, so I guess there's a few people calling. That's 800-347-5151. But I do know some of our listeners just do it old school the way I do. They write a check and put it in the mail. So what do they need to do there?
It goes to, goes to Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. But please get that in the mail right away, because it needs to be postmarked no later than tomorrow in order to be counted for the match. And we definitely need your help to get the match, because as Kerby said, if we don't see the money come in, we don't get the full match from these donors. So we need your help for this.
Well, again, thank you for, in the busyness of your life, coming in here for a few minutes and telling us what's going on. And so, Warren Kelly, thanks you very much. Let's, if I can, get into, just real quickly, I was anticipating that the Supreme Court might rule on this issue of abortion. So the article that I posted last night was by Katie Yoder. And it talks about whether or not the media prepared for what they thought might be a devastating blow. Well, it was not. It went the other direction. It was not 5-4 upholding the Louisiana legislature and the statute, but instead 5-4 striking it down. Now, you can already say, well, what happened? I think the theory that I have, and it could be as wrong as anybody else's, but it's also one that Kelly Shackelford and I think as well, is that it is possible that Chief Justice John Roberts, especially on this case, the Louisiana law was very similar to the one out of Texas that at that time was struck down. Now, it's a different court, so that's why many people thought that the conservative court would vote the other way. But it wasn't a big challenge to the issue of abortion. As a matter of fact, you could honestly say it had only a little bit to do with abortion, because what it was actually requiring is that a doctor that was offering abortion services had to have admitting privileges at a hospital, and that is an attempt to certainly protect the life of the mother, but it also would have reduced the number of abortion clinics, as you have seen how that sometimes when it has been implemented other places or when other restrictions have been implemented, whether it's a 24-hour waiting period, informed consent, requiring that the abortion clinic have the right kind of medical facilities, whatever it might be, what it tended to do very quickly is reduce the number of abortion clinics in America. So nevertheless, it was a 5-4 decision that went that way, and it seems like Chief Justice Roberts maybe thought to himself, as much as I would probably, as I had in the first case, uphold it, maybe if I vote the other way right now, the court will still have some level of legitimacy, and it will really leave to the people that are going to vote in November to determine whether or not they want to head down that direction or turn that around. And it also, I think, very interestingly, helped Donald Trump's campaign strategy, because even people right now that have been supportive of President Donald Trump and have wanted to vote for him again and maybe even have supported his candidacy have been critical of his candidacy so far, because a lot of what he has done is spend time talking about things like putting more justices in the federal courts. Well, that was a great 2016 theme, especially when you had an open seat for the Supreme Court. And so a lot of people simply thought, you are actually trying to run a 2020 campaign using the themes of 2016. Well, today, like it or not, agree with it or not, this has once again reminded people that, there's going to be some more vacancies on the Supreme Court. Just the other day when the president was speaking, he talked about actually having 200 judges confirmed to the federal courts, hoping to have as many as 300 by the end of this term. Now, this illustrates again that if you really are concerned about things like abortion and marriage and immigration and a variety of others, this is really going to be even more so. So that I thought was kind of interesting. And so the article that I've posted here actually gives you, coming from Katie Yoder, some of the original concerns from the liberal media, New York Times, New York Magazine, NBC News, and some of the others that are listed there, fearful that this ruling would go the other way. But now today, instead of cheering, they're all sort of asking, what's up with Chief Justice John Roberts? And we'll probably spend some more time talking about that over the next couple of days. But let me get to my second article that I've posted here, and this comes from Fred Lucas. Over the last couple of weeks, I've just tried to educate you a little bit on the Black Lives Matter movement, which is different than the concept of Black Lives Matter. And again, the four things real quickly before we take a break. Are Black Lives leaders, are Black Lives Matter leaders, probably better to say, trained Marxists? Yes, they are. Give some really good quotes from Patrice Cuellar and Alice Garza, where they claim to be trained organizers and trained Marxists. What's the official organization? Well, there's more than one, and a lot of people tend to know the global network. That would be the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. But this goes into some details and also talks a little bit about the 1,000 Currents, which I'll get to in just a minute. What does the organization want? And again, you can find that by simply going to the website, but there are a lot of things on there that have to do with sustainability, transgenderism, cisgender privilege, all sorts of stuff that you want to say, I thought this was about African Americans. And then, of course, the whole section on what are 1,000 Currents and how lots of this is funded. And so I wanted you to have this article because it is really true. Fred Lucas has done, I think, another article, and I've posted a few others on why Christians would have real questions about supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and organizations. And you can certainly read those articles, post them. And, of course, you can also go to the own website because they're pretty explicit about what they want to actually try to enact as legislation and what they really want to bring about. And as we heard just a minute ago from Colonel Allen West, when some of them are just so blatant by saying, we just want to burn it all down, and burn it down, we might mean figuratively or we might mean it literally. But we'll have to just see. Those are the kinds of statements you're seeing right now that should cause all of us to have some pause and so some concern. So those are a couple of articles that we've posted on the website. They are there for you to read. They are there for you if you think they're worthwhile to post on your Facebook page or Twitter page or send by an email. Educate some others. We have a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have so much to cover that if I don't cover it one day, it's not because we didn't think it's important. We just run out of time. But I thought I would at least acknowledge that we do have a pandemic going on here. And as Jim McGarity points out, we bent the curve and largely kept our hospitals from being overrun. But now we're seeing the curve bent back up again in a couple of states. And I'll have more to say about that in just a minute. But the sad reality is it's become, again, a political football when it should not. People's lives are at stake. And I think what he says here, one of the most depressing aspects of the rise in cases over the past 2 weeks has been the persistent desire to hammer the new wave of cases into some sort of my party's governors are good and your party's governors are bad, or blue states rule and red states drool. That's great. But, let's face it, some of the states that were hit hard in the past were up in the New England area, or the Northeast, probably better way to say it, New York, New Jersey, but also Connecticut and some of those. And now, of course, we still have blue states that, like California and Oregon, Washington, some that are still affected. And yes, you have the red states too. You have the Texas, Florida, Arizona. And it just seems to me that it just doesn't do any good to bash one part of the country in favor of the other, but to recognize that there are some things that need to take place. And now we're starting to see more and more not only trying to compare the various states and governors, but to compare the United States to the rest of the world. And that's why I appreciated this piece in the Wall Street Journal that came out the other day. The America is a Failure reporting has a heavy dose of partisanship. They said scientists are studying why the coronavirus hasn't had more of a resurgence in Europe after countries lifted their lockdowns while some U.S. states battle explosive outbreaks. But the epidemiologists and the media already know why. It's Republican governors, and of course, it's Republican Donald Trump. Of course, that's the argument being made. And yet, if you want to read and listen and watch with some level of discernment, here's how to start looking at this in a more intelligent way. And that is to look at the number, for example, of deaths per 100,000 people. If you look at that, the United States is doing very well compared to other countries, because deaths per 100,000 people, United States is 38. United Kingdom is 66. Spain, 61, Italy, 57, France, 44. Again, you can see some huge numbers, and that is the case. More than 120,000. Not the 120 million that Joe Biden said the other day, but 120,000 deaths, which are horrible. But the reality is, if you do that and recognize that we have a very large country, if you look deaths per 1,000, the United States doing okay, and you wouldn't know any of that by watching the media. One of the other articles I posted, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there's always been this desire to give statehood to the District of Columbia, which is an extremely small section of land, and there are better ways to do that. So John Funn, in particular, said if there was ever an issue that called out for a compromise, it's finding a way to give 700,000 Americans who live in the District of Columbia full congressional representation. Of course, that's not what we had. We had a vote the other day in the House of Representatives calling for the creation of a state of Washington Douglas Commonwealth. And the argument is Frederick Douglass, African-American 19th century individual, who argued that it was sad that people that lived in the district did not have a voice in practical politics. So what you have right now is a Washington, D.C. House delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton. But there's a simple solution to this, and it's one that has already been done once. We just need to do it again. And that is Congress can give back to Maryland and Virginia what it created in the district back in 1801 when Thomas Jefferson was the president. It's called retrocession, and the job is half done because in 1847, the federal government ceded the portion of the District of Columbia and the south of the Potomac River back to Virginia. Those are now called the cities, I should say, of Alexandria and Arlington. And residents there can elect their U.S. House of member and their 2 senators, and in some respects have all the freedom that they might want to do. So the solution is pretty simple, and that is simply to allow the current residents in Washington, D.C. that are in that area that used to be Maryland to become residents in a newly designated, we'll call it Douglas County, in honor of Frederick Douglass. We'll call it Douglas County, Maryland, and they would then share in the state's representation. By the way, they would have quite a bit of influence, as it turns out, and they would be able to also participate in the legislature, and the issue would go away. Now, the reason the issue is promoted the way it is simply because if indeed you made Washington, D.C. a state, they would get 2 senators and a representative. Guess what political party they would represent? And I think we all know the answer there. Would anybody in the House of Representatives have voted for this the other day if the indication was that it would actually generate 2 more Republican senators? It's done because it's the goal to actually elect and get 2 more Democratic senators. I think we're good enough with 50 states. We don't need 51, but there is a very concrete solution to how to do that. It is something that's been done in history. And so if somebody even asks you about this, that's not exactly the top of the mind kind of story, but I just wanted to post it there for you to know that there are indeed some answers to some of this. One more issue just before we take a break, and let me just give you a preview. Dr. William Lane Craig will be with us in the next hour. We'll be talking about his new book, Atonement and the Death of Christ. You know, we talk about Christ died for your sins, and if you're a Christian, you say, of course. But think about that. How is the death of Christ actually saving me from my sins? And so we're going to get into it in a little more theological area. And it's helpful because if you're talking to a non-Christian who hasn't grown up in the church, they're going, how is this person that died 2,000 years ago on a cross? How does that affect me at all? If you talk to your Muslim friends, they sometimes have questions about this. So this is not just sort of a theological conundrum, but it's something that kind of shows up in terms of evangelism and apologetics. And anytime we can listen to William Lane Craig, who is such a clear expositor and an ability to really help us with some of these issues of apologetics, we thought we would have him come in for a while to share some of that. And let me just mention as well, some of you have been asking, are there any individuals that are going to be charged with tearing down these monuments? Yes, we have 4 now. Over the weekend, 1 already was arraigned and some others coming down. And so the Justice Department has announced charges against at least 4 individuals trying to tear down that Andrew Jackson statue in Lafayette Square. More to come. And as we pointed out the other day, there is a piece of legislation that would allow the court to actually sentence somebody up to 10 years for willful injury of federal property. So we'll see where that takes us. But some of you are saying, are we going to do anything? And the answer is, well, some things are happening. And maybe you'll hear that in the news, but I suspect that's just another one of those stories that you probably won't hear about. Maybe once they're actually in court, they'll follow the story. But up until then, you may have heard it first right here on Point of View, which is a good reason as we go to a break to consider what you might do to support this ministry. And if you can do so, we have a banner on the website. It says $100,000 matching fund, but it only is released when you are able to give. So your pledge or your gift will be greatly appreciated. And it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can give us a call during the break. The pledge line number is 800-347-5151. That's different than the call-in line. And when we come back, we'll spend some time talking with William Lane Craig about the atonement and the death of Christ. And my commentary today is about judicial contradictions, pointing out the very striking difference between what Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court said in one case and how he ruled just the other day. So it, I think, strikes me once again as the need to pay attention to who's going to be the president, who's going to be in the United States Senate, because those are the individuals ultimately are going to determine who's in the federal judiciary and whether we get better or worse decisions coming down from the courts. Let's take a break. We'll come back and spend a little time in theology, evangelism, and apologetics. All that coming up right after this.
America's major media are out of control. Many of them apparently believe their role is to publish things that create hysteria and outrage with false narratives, and facts don't matter. You don't believe that. Neither do we at Point of View. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020 will be determined over the next handful of hours. June is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership today will help us set our budget for the coming months. You and Point of View, a powerful team for such a time as this. And right now, every gift you give will be doubled up to $100,000. So double your investment when you join the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't wait. Visit or call now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time a little bit later this hour talking with William Lane Craig about his book, Atonement and the Death of Christ. But I thought just before we do that, we did just mention in passing when we had Colonel Alan West with us, this idea of cancel culture. And we've seen this in a variety of different ways. Oklahoma State football coach Mike Gundy wearing the wrong T-shirt, and all the students and the faculty and the football players saying they're going to leave. And, of course, Aunt Jemima can't be on the front. You may have seen the Simpsons have decided to use only non-white actors to voice non-white characters. You've had people raising questions about whether or not we can use certain kinds of words like the word master. One real estate group said, well, we'll never call it a master bedroom again because that might conjure up the idea of slavery. You have South Park that included depictions of the Prophet Muhammad not available, but now they're pulling all sorts of other things. Splash Mountain, as I mentioned just a minute ago, for some reason that has been criticized because it gives maybe a positive portrayal of African Americans in the antebellum South, and so you've seen that. You probably noticed Dixie Chicks is now just called the Chicks. Can't be Dixie anymore. And well, I can go on and on and on. You know what I'm talking about if you have not seen some of those. Those are some that you just sort of roll your eyes over, but there are many that are much more serious because they essentially try to drive people out of any kind of livelihood, ruin their careers. Of course, I have this week one that is going to be relevant to that as well, J.K. Rowling. And so, again, there are just a lot of those, but it has become even more kind of bizarre because after Jimmy Kimmel got himself in some trouble for having more blackface, I think it was back when he was doing the Man Show, and then making some really perverted comments towards, at that time, a 15-year-old Megan Fox. He issued a little bit of an apology after these blackface videos resurfaced, and so everybody was saying, well, look, the conservatives are going after the liberals on a cancel culture, and there was actually an article in Newsweek, Conservatives Weaponize Cancel Culture to Tame Anti-Trump Celebrities. And the writer of this, Jennifer Van Laar, said, excuse me? There's no evidence that any anti-Trump celebrities are being tamed in any way, aside from being offended that Kimmel was called out for his hypocrisy. The writer seems to believe the only progressives are qualified to point these things out. And then goes through this long list. Whether it's Elisa Milano and all the Covington Catholic kids, you remember that one, and there are a lot of those. They got Bette Midler in here. They got Kathy Griffin, remember, holding up, this bloodied replica of Donald Trump's head. How many careers have been ruined in that regard? I can't think of too many. And so, if nothing else, it is amazing to me that while this cancel culture has been, in many ways, used against individuals, not even necessarily conservatives, I can point to, and maybe I need to do a commentary on all the individuals that have been forced to resign, many times in the academy, for just asking a question about Black Lives Matter in the last couple of weeks. It is just horrendous. And so then for Newsweek to post a piece implying that the conservatives are using the cancel culture is a little bit ludicrous. If for no other reason, I come back to my favorite line from Jordan Peterson. One time, Jordan Peterson was doing a debate, and he's talking about just the radical leftist ideas in the university. And finally, somebody called him out and said, you're talking about these radicals, these leftist people in the university, but you hardly ever talk about these radical rightists. And he said, well, first of all, I have. But second of all, let me put it in perspective. Nobody in the radical right runs the universities. Nobody in the radical right runs Hollywood. You run it. And that was a good line here. There may be some people that want to try to end Jimmy Kimmel's career or Jimmy Fallon's career, or they want to argue about something that was said by some comedian, but most of the time, even the most rabid radical left, or radical right, I should say, they have kind of a whatever, live and let live and go on from there. But they don't, even if they wanted to, have the power to do that. But the cancel culture has been using that power pretty effectively all the time. And so I thought I'd also mention one other concern while we're talking about the pandemic and some of those issues. The CDC is really coming under some criticism right now because they have been conflating both viral tests and antibody tests. And you might say, well, what is the point about that? Well, the first test gives you the current coronavirus infections, whereas the second helps you understand if somebody ever has had the virus. And by conflating those together, it has been something that has caused people, even in the healthcare industry, to just shake their heads. How could bureaucrats make such a terrible mistake? Here's a quote from the professor of global health at Harvard and also the director of the Harvard Global Health Institute. Said, "You got to be kidding me. How could the CDC make such a mistake? This is a mess." And of course, that's affecting a lot of these various states right now trying to make intelligent decisions. We're talking about Texas, we're talking about Florida, we're talking about Georgia, talking about a number of places like that, that in some cases are even affected by this, or maybe in the case they have, for example, in Pennsylvania, they're using the same kind of nomenclature, and so people just are not making wise decisions about some of those issues. So while we talk about not only the pandemic, we also, of course, have been talking about the protest. And I don't know if you've been following this, and since we only have 2 minutes, let me just get into it fairly quickly. There are more and more that are saying we're no longer going to play the Star-Spangled Banner. Matter of fact, we may just do a program one day in which I want to just maybe open up the phones and say, do you think it's worth even playing the Star-Spangled Banner at a baseball game, if we ever have one, or at a football game, especially since, first of all, you have a number of individuals who are going to want to take the knee. Then you have a number from other countries around the world, and they're not American citizens. And then even the American citizens are shuffling and sometimes not even holding their hand over their heart. I mean, do we even want to do that? But some are saying, well, we want to get rid of the Star-Spangled Banner, but what do we want to replace it with? Well, Tulsa Athletic said they'll no longer play the Star-Spangled Banner, at least in home games, because they wanted to develop a culture of inclusion. So instead, they'll play Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land. And I really hadn't thought about it till I read Todd Starnes the other day. He was talking about it in another piece, in which he reminded us, and I kind of forgot about this, that Woody Guthrie, of course, was a supporter of communism, very sympathetic to the cause of communism. Matter of fact, wrote This Land Is Your Land because he was so irritated by Irving Berlin's God Bless America, sung by Kate Smith. And so that's actually why we even have that. So I don't know if this soccer team thinks they're trying to be political and support communism, but nevertheless, that's what they want to replace it with. There's another columnist, journalist, Kevin Powell. He says he wants to cancel the Star-Spangled Banner. There's that cancel culture. And he wants to replace it with John Lennon's Imagine. Oh, that just rings my heart here. Why Imagine? He says, well, because it's the most beautiful, unifying, all people, all backgrounds together kind of song you have. It's also a song written, by the way, by an Englishman who dreams of a world with no countries, no religion, nothing to kill or die for. And John Lennon himself said, the lyrics are just virtually the Communist Manifesto. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Perhaps you have heard the phrase that people follow their basic principles until they don't. As much as most of us try to follow key principles in our life, whether they are principles of leadership, family, or morality, sometimes an issue arises that changes our behavior. That is certainly true of judicial interpretation. While on the Supreme Court, Justice Neil Gorsuch has staked out his belief that legislatures, not the judiciary, should make law. And he has on more than one occasion been willing to tell Congress or a state legislature to write a less ambiguous law and not depend on the Supreme Court to fix it. That is why his opinion in the Bostock case is most confusing. The editors of the Wall Street Journal started their editorial with these words: "An alien appears to have occupied the body of Justice Neil Gorsuch as he wrote Monday's opinion." When Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was attempting to outlaw discrimination based on such issues as race, color, religion, and national origin. An amendment was proposed to include sex in the statute. It is obvious to just about anyone in 1964 the word sex meant male and female, but Justice Gorsuch ruled that it includes sexual orientation and gender identity. In previous Supreme Court rulings, he has ruled that it's a fundamental canon of statutory construction that words generally should be interpreted as taking their ordinary, contemporary, common meaning at the time Congress enacted the statute. That is not what he and the other justices did in the case. Justice Gorsuch and other justices reinterpreted the meaning of the word sex to fit their desired conclusion. This is a debate that should have been taking place in Congress, but the Supreme Court short-circuited the debate that should have been taking place in a legislative body, not in the court. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
It's always a privilege when we have on the program Dr. William Lane Craig, and if you are not familiar with him, he is the research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, also professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University, graduate of Wheaton College, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, the University of Birmingham in England, University of Munich in Germany, and a variety of other places. Matter of fact, he has a group that is called Reasonable Faith, and there are more than 800,000 Facebook followers and individuals on some campuses that I think you're going to really want to know more about. He has authored or edited over 30 different books, as well as over 100 articles in professional journals of philosophy and theology. He's done a number of debates. From time to time, I've been able to moderate a couple of those debates. And we're going to talk about this question of the atonement and the death of Christ. How is it that the death of Christ atones for our sins? You know, if you grow up in the church, you say, oh, that sounds pretty obvious. We've heard that before. But if you talk to a non-Christian or you talk to your Muslim friends, they give you this puzzled look about how does that even fit, and why does what something happened to an individual 2,000 years ago have any impact on my spiritual situation? So I think it's a really good book and a really good conversation. So Dr. William Lane Craig, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby. Good to talk with you again.
It would be great to see you face to face, but we aren't doing much traveling. I suspect you aren't probably doing a whole lot of presentations and debates, except that we all still rely on Zoom. But let's get into this, because there's 15 chapters, and in about 45 minutes, we're going to do our best to try to give a brief overview. And I guess the first one is atonement. A lot of people hear the word and think maybe it comes from the Greek or Latin, but actually it comes from the Middle English, doesn't it?
Yes, it comes from a Middle English expression meaning at one-ment, or a state of unity or a state of harmony. The closest New Testament word for atonement in that sense would be reconciliation. And it's through Christ's death that we are reconciled to God and come to this state of at one-ment with Him. We are at one with Him. But what really stunned me, Kerby, in doing this study is that that is not the sense in which the biblical words translated atonement are used. That is the etymological meaning of the word atonement, but the biblical words that are translated atonement have a quite different meaning. In Hebrew, the Hebrew root word is kippur, familiar to most of us in the Yom Kippur Jewish festival. And kippur has the meaning to cleanse or to purify. And the meaning of atonement in that sense is the cleansing or purification of impurity or sin. And this is so important because what that means is that most contemporary atonement theories don't really connect with the biblical sense of the word. They're about achieving reconciliation with God, but they ignore the biblical notion of atonement, which is this idea of cleansing or purification of sin.
I think that's important, and one of the reasons why you wrote the book. Anytime you write a book, you say, okay, am I going to contribute something or repeat what has been out there? But this is a good example. And the first section, which I thought we might focus on a little bit, is what you call the biblical data concerning the atonement. The first chapter is on this idea of sacrifice, the Christ sacrifice on the cross. So help us understand how this idea of sacrifice then fits into this idea of our salvation and our atonement.
There are a number of motifs in the New Testament used to describe Christ's death. And I think the most prominent of these is the notion of Christ's death as a sacrificial offering to God. And the background of this notion is the Levitical animal sacrifices that were offered in the tabernacle and the temple for the purification of sins. The book of Leviticus was never very interesting to me, Kerby, as I read it with all of these
everybody would agree
about butchering the animals and the blood and the guts. But I'll tell you, as a result of this study, the book of Leviticus just came alive to me because it's in these animal sacrifices that we have the conceptual background for understanding Christ's death as a sacrifice.
And I might just mention that there are so many valuable things in this book, but one of those is this chart that you have on animal sacrifices in Leviticus. And for an individual that wanted to teach or preach about evangelism or salvation, or maybe it's come time as you're reading through the Bible in 1 year, you get to Leviticus, this would be helpful because this chart, which looks at the various ideas of peace offering, burnt offering, sin offering, it all just bundled together. For the first time, you've got a chart there that starts making some sense. I guess this actually comes from Leon Morris, but again, it just helped kind of straighten out some of this because, like you said, Leviticus is where we leave a lot of people that decide they're going to read through the Bible, and by the time they get there, they're just, I give up. And so this might be helpful. But let's get to another one. The idea of Isaiah's servant of the Lord, Isaiah 52 and 53, so important.
Oh, I think this is absolutely critical because in Isaiah 53, you have this enigmatic figure, the servant of the Lord, who is righteous before God, but who dies bearing the punishment for the sins of the people. And this is the clearest expression of the idea of substitutionary punishment, where God lays the punishment that the people deserved on his righteous servant instead, so that they might be forgiven. And the New Testament authors again and again turned to Isaiah 53 and applied that to Jesus. For example, in 1 Peter, it says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree that we might die to sin and be reconciled to God. And all through the New Testament, you find this motif of the servant of the Lord of Isaiah 53 employed.
Well, one of the other motifs I thought we might talk about are the Old Testament justice motifs. You have a whole chapter here on divine justice, and that's really important too, because people, I think, sometimes don't understand the need for salvation because they don't understand the holiness of God. They don't understand God's judgment and God's justice, and in a sense, those Old Testament motifs are really important, aren't they?
They are, because, again, they provide the background for Paul's book of Romans, where it's employing all of this legal terminology from the courtroom about condemnation and guilt and pardon and justification, all of these legal terms. And some people who aren't aware of the background might think that Paul is importing all of these foreign concepts of legal notions to the doctrine of the atonement, when in fact it suffuses the Old Testament. The Old Testament is full of this terminology of righteousness, condemnation, pardon, guilt before God, and so forth. So again, that Old Testament background is really important if we're going to understand the teaching of the book of Romans.
So we'll take a break and we'll come back and spend another half an hour really kind of focusing on the atonement and the death of Christ. This book, I think, would be very helpful for those of you that find yourself in a teaching or preaching phenomenon and situation. It is published by Baylor University Press, so again, you can probably order it online. We have a link to it so that you could get it either in hardback or in Kindle, so that is available. We also have a link to, of course, William Lane Craig's website, reasonablefaith.org. We're going to talk a little bit more later about what's available there. And I've only picked out just a couple of the chapters there on the biblical data concerning the atonement, but now when we get back from the break, maybe we'll look at kind of the history of the doctrine of the atonement. And then we'll look at some of the philosophical reflections on that. When you hear words like justification and substitution and penal substitution, what all that might mean, these are words sometimes those of us that occasionally teach in a seminary like I do, or somebody who teaches all the time in places like a seminary like William Lane Craig, we'll try to break those down, and maybe you'll have a better understanding, first of all, of what Christ did on the cross for you, and maybe even have a better and clearer understanding about how to share your faith with others and to help them understand why the death of Christ was so important for your sin, for your salvation, and for your eternal life. Let's take a break, though. We are just privileged, as we always are, to have Dr. William Lane Craig with us. If you'd like to know more about him during the break, you might go to the website that is there, pointofview.net. But don't forget, we also are coming to the end of our fiscal year, which is tomorrow. So if you can help us out, we have a match on the table. That means a gift of $10 becomes $20. A gift of $100 becomes $200. We'll be right back.
America's major media are out of control. Many of them apparently believe their role is to publish things that create hysteria and outrage with false narratives, and facts don't matter. You don't believe that. Neither do we at Point of View. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020 will be determined over the next handful of hours. June is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership today will help us set our budget for the coming months. You and Point of View, a powerful team for such a time as this. And right now, every gift you give will be doubled up to $100,000. So double your investment when you join the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't wait. Visit or call now. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
The topic is the Atonement and the death of Christ, an exegetical, historical, and philosophical exploration. Dr. William Lane Craig with us. Been looking at the biblical data, and I think I'll pick out one more before we get on to some of the historical, material, and philosophical. And if you would like to know more about Dr. William Lane Craig, we have a link to his website. Also have a link to this book in case you would like to get a copy of it, and it would certainly help you understand a lot more and really have even a greater appreciation for what Christ has done and why Christ's death on the cross was so important. But one of your chapters, Dr. Craig, is, of course, representation and redemption. Now, we oftentimes see in the theology of Paul, Christ is our representative before God. But you brought us something I never even thought about, and that is when they would lay their hands on the animal sacrifice, that was to symbolize the identification. So it wasn't just a substitute. It's almost like I was symbolically participating with the animal's fate. So there's a sense in which that word representation means more when you really get back into that book of Leviticus that most of us didn't like reading our way through.
Yes, again, it just came alive to me in a way I'd never appreciated before. This element of the hand-laying ceremony before the animal was killed is part of every animal sacrifice that is offered. The offerer himself is to put his hand on the animal's head, and the Hebrew verb there means to press. This is an emphatic gesture. He presses his hand onto the head of the sacrificial animal, and then the offerer himself kills the animal. The priest does not do it. It's the offerer who does it. And I think by this act, he is symbolically identifying himself with the animal, which then suffers the fate that the offerer deserves, namely death. And so you can imagine for the people who offered these sacrifices, what a graphic representation of sin and its consequences these acts were.
Yes. And the other part of that is not only representation, but redemption. And that really resonated with me because you think of, verses that talk about you were ransomed, you were bought with a price. That whole idea of redemption, of course, we understand that. Those of us old enough, remember we used to collect green stamps and we then would go to the redemption center. Maybe that's a little bit too crass. But yeah, only us old guys remember that stuff. But again, the idea that you are redeemed, there's a price, and you were bought with a price is another part of what you talk about in that chapter.
Yes, exactly right. The idea of ransoming was a payment that could be made, for example, to free someone from slavery, to buy them back, or to buy back people who have been taken as prisoners of war. And this ransom payment would purchase their freedom and set them free. And this is used then in the New Testament and the Old Testament as a motif for describing how we have been redeemed from sin by God, and in the New Testament by Christ's blood, which is the price of our redemption.
Wow. So again, these are just a few of the things. Go ahead. And again, these are kind of some of the biblical data: sacrifice and Isaiah's servant of the Lord, divine justice and representation and redemption. I thought for just a minute we wouldn't spend a lot of time on the history, but you do have a nice section in there taking us from the early church fathers all the way to the Reformation and afterwards. And in some respects, there's been kind of a historical flow of this doctrine, hasn't there?
Yes, I think that's true, though what I discovered in this section that was most enlightening to me, Kerby, is how terribly these classic authors are caricatured in the secondary literature. I would almost dare to say that if you pick up a secondary source about the doctrine of the atonement, you will find it misrepresenting these figures like Anselm and Grotius and the reformers. It it really is irresponsible how they've been caricatured.
Wow.
And then you see that makes them straw men for easy criticism and rejection of their viewpoints.
Wow. Well, and if nothing else, that if we were doing a church history program, we'd focus on that. But I didn't want to miss the sections that we could have on philosophy, because one of my favorite philosophers on the phone with me right now. So let's get into each one of those. Penal substitution. I've heard of, a sermon or two on that, but that's probably really new information for a lot of our listeners. So let's explain maybe what we mean by this idea of penal substitution, and then you focus on one aspect of that, its coherence.
Yes. The idea here is that Christ on the cross bore the suffering which we deserved as the punishment for our sins. So the just desert of our punishment, the just desert of our sins was death. And Christ on the cross bore that for every person. That's the idea of penal substitution.
And what you have is there have been some that say that's incoherent. And so you sort of give a response to that, because this is something that, again, I've run into sometimes with non-Christians, but especially with Muslims, maybe you have as well, where they go, okay, I don't understand how an individual 2,000 years ago dies on the cross that has anything to do with my sin before God, or, if I'm talking Muslim, even a sin before Allah. And so in some respects, they don't understand that connection point. Maybe we can see if we can help them out here.
Yes, the difficulty that they have is primarily expressed by saying, how can one person be justly punished for a sin that he didn't commit, that somebody else committed? How can that be justly done by God? And what is key, I think, to understanding this doctrine is the notion of the imputation of sin.
There you go.
And the idea here is that my sin was legally imputed to Christ so that he could be justly punished in my place for my sin. Now, imputation is a legal term. It doesn't mean that Christ actually became a wicked, selfish, cruel, lustful person. Rather, it means that he was declared legally guilty before God, and therefore could be justly punished for my sins. And what I argue, and again, this was completely new to me, is that the notion of the imputation of wrongdoing to a blameless third party is a very widespread and commonly accepted feature of our criminal justice system. It goes on all the time. And so those who object to this will have to object to the whole Anglo-American criminal justice system as a result, since it features this idea of imputation. And in legal terminology, this goes by the name vicarious liability.
Mm-hmm.
People can be held vicariously liable for wrongs that others have committed. And this happens both in civil law and in criminal law as well.
And I was just thinking, as I was looking through, it's in chapter 10 there about the imputation of sins and then vicarious liability. This might also be a book you might hand to a lawyer who understands the legal system, who has always been kind of, I don't know about this Christianity stuff. By the time he or she gets into chapters 9 and 10, they're going to be going, this really looks like the kind of case I would make in a courtroom, and this is sort of a divine courtroom. So I'm seeing this as a book that I could give to some of my non-Christian lawyers.
I was advised and helped in this book by Professor of Law Eric de Shoemaker at the Edinburgh School of Law in Scotland. And he helped to guide me into the legal literature. And then I read scores of court opinions on this. So you're absolutely right. Someone who is a practicing attorney would find these concepts very familiar. And who I also thought of in this connection would be convicts.
Wow.
There are lots of Christian Bible studies being held in prisons with people who have experienced our criminal justice system and who would really understand these concepts that lie behind the doctrine of substitutionary atonement.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. William Lane Craig, Atonement and the Death of Christ. And we'll get into this idea of satisfaction of divine justice, because that's certainly a key issue, and divine pardon. And again, if you find yourself saying you went too fast, well, yes, I mean, the book is 280 pages. Yeah, we're not going to cover it all as quickly as you would like or as slowly as you would like, but we gave you a pretty good overview. We'll cover a few more points with Dr. William Lane Craig right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. William Lane Craig with us for a few more minutes. Let me just real quickly point to his website again, reasonablefaith.org. That's where you can find his other books, many of his articles. There's an open forum. If you are located near a college campus, there may be a Reasonable Faith chapter there, or you could start one. There are the podcasts, there are the videos, and all sorts of resources. We have that at our website, pointofview.net, and it's at reasonablefaith.org. You know, your chapter on satisfaction of divine justice is so important, because when you interact with people that have kind of a works-oriented salvation, various religions, cults, things of that nature, there's never a assurance that I will have done enough good works to merit favor before God. And here we can actually say that we will know, as it says in the scriptures, that we have eternal life because of the satisfaction of divine justice. Explain that if you might.
Right. Well, the idea is that because of our sin, we find ourselves before God's bar of justice as condemned criminals, and therefore under the sentence of death. But Christ satisfies divine justice for us by dying in our place. Now, no finite human being could die for the sins of all of humanity. But because Christ is divine, he is God himself, the second person of the Trinity. And therefore, his sacrifice has infinite value and therefore is able to satisfy divine justice on behalf of all persons.
The other part of this, which is maybe two-part, is the idea of divine pardon. So we have divine justice because Jesus is divine, then we can actually have an assurance of salvation. But there's another aspect of that. You have a chapter that deals with divine pardon and its effects, and then in a minute we'll talk about justification and the appropriation of divine pardon. But what about divine pardon? Because, again, that would be something that, as you said, lawyers, criminals, and really most Americans would understand what a pardon looks like. We've seen it happen so many times.
This was, again, one of the surprising revelations to me of doing this study, and that is that God's forgiveness of sins is a lot more like a legal pardon issued by the president than it is like the forgiveness that takes place in personal, private relationships. Because it's not simply a giving up of anger or resentment or bitterness that someone else is having wronged you. Rather, it is a legal notion that cancels the criminal debt of the person who is pardoned, declares him not guilty, and sets him free. So that a legal pardon is the means of redemption. It is the means by which we are set free. And God, as the executive authority over the world, has given us a pardon in Christ on the basis of his satisfaction of divine justice for us.
I love in one place where you quote Chief Justice John Marshall, a pardon is an act of grace proceeding from the power entrusted with the execution of laws. And a pardon has come to mean a lot more as I have over the years occasionally had a chance to meet somebody who has been pardoned, Chuck Colson, Dinesh D'Souza, how significant that was. And again, I had no idea that this idea of pardon is more like what we see coming from, say, a president than what we say when we say, well, I forgive you. But at least I want to get one other chapter in there, and that is this idea of justification and appropriation of divine pardon, because in some respects that brings us into the idea that even though you can be pardoned, you have to accept it. Even though it is a free gift, you still have to be willing to accept it. Explain that if you might.
Yes. This was really interesting, too. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that a pardon by the president or governor is not effective unless and until the criminal accepts it. He can refuse the pardon, in which case he will still be guilty and have to be punished, even though the executive authority has pardoned him. And this emphasizes, now theologically, the need for personal repentance and faith in Christ to appropriate the pardon that God offers us.
Yes, very good. And then you do have some concluding chapters. Any final comments I want to let you have before we end the interview? But if nothing else, we gave people a little bit of an overview of a book that I think is going to be the kind of book you might want to hand to somebody who doesn't understand salvation. Maybe somebody's got a legal background. This would be intriguing to them because of the number of quotes you have from justices and legal opinions and things of that nature that I think very clearly explain the atonement and the death of Christ. So just before we go, talk about how people can maybe use this book. I've got some ideas, but I know you have some as well as an author.
Yeah, I think that the atonement just lies at the very heart of Christian theology. There could be nothing more central than the death of Christ for our sins. And so I really do think that any Christian can benefit from a deeper understanding of the atonement. But as you say, especially people who have a background in law or criminal justice, I think they're going to especially resonate with these ideas.
As we send people to your website, which is Reasonable Faith, there are a lot of resources there, but talk about what is available, because I hope our listeners will go there and watch some of the videos, get the podcast, find some of your books. What's there that is available to our listeners?
Most all of my scholarly articles and popular articles that have been published in print are available on the website for reading. In addition to that, every week there's a new question of the week that I answer from readers who send in their questions. And then also every week we add a new lesson of my Sunday school class called Defenders, in which we are surveying the whole range of Christian doctrine. And those go up fresh every week. And then there's all of these videos of debates, interviews, speaking engagements that are available as well. They're just an enormous range of material. Oh, and one other thing that's really great, we have been developing a series of animated videos on key apologetic topics. And these have been brilliantly done by an animator that we've hired. And there's about 13 or 14 of these animated videos now, each one only about 3 minutes long, on questions like the existence of God, the claims of Christ, the resurrection of Jesus, how can Christ be the only way of salvation, and so forth.
Very good. Well, William Lane Craig, Dr. Craig, it's always great to have you on the program. Thank you for the website, thank you for the book, and thank you for giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby, and thank you for having read the book so carefully in order to conduct this interview. It makes it a real pleasure for an author to respond to questions from someone who's really read the book.
Well, thank you so very much, and thank you for writing it. Just before we run out of time, again, we have a click. You can click through to Reasonable Faith, but don't forget, we are down to the last day tomorrow, and so if you can respond today, we would greatly appreciate it. 1 day, 9 hours, 2 minutes, they say, until we're out. And so we, again, have a $100,000 matching fund, and if you have been appreciative of the fact that we've talked about everything from some of the issues in the news to teaching you some great theology, maybe that'd be worth your financial investment alone. So that is all available at the website, pointofview.net. If you want to find links to Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, William Lane Craig, any of the articles I've mentioned today, they're all available. That's a resource we make available to you, and if you'd like to say thank you with a gift, we would greatly appreciate it as well. We'll be back here tomorrow for the last day in our fiscal year, but first of all, I want to thank Ivy and Elisa and Doug for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
America's major media are out of control. Many of them apparently believe their role is to publish things that create hysteria and outrage with false narratives, and facts don't matter. You don't believe that. Neither do we at Point of View. Truth matters. Facts matter. And that's why Kerby Anderson and the team at Point of View matter. Together, we bring the information you need to rightly respond to what's happening. And Point of View's ability to perform that role in the second half of 2020 will be determined over the next handful of hours. June is the end of our fiscal year, and your partnership today will help us set our budget for the coming months. You and Point of View, a powerful team for such a time as this. And right now, every gift you give will be doubled up to $100,000. So double your investment when you join the team online at pointofview.net/team or by phone 800-347-5151. Don't wait. Visit or call now. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.